A pleasant afternoon to everyone. So we are the Group 10 and we are going to report about the Philippine cartoons, the political caricature of the American era. So before anything else, I would like to ask you, are you familiar with the word cartoon? Yes, it is quite popular nowadays, especially to children. So examples of these are Peppa Pig, Coco Melon, Phineas and Ferb, and many more. So how do we define political cartoons, by the way? So, political cartoons are integral components in the framework of political journalism. So, it is one of the integral framework in the political journalism, right? So, they offer brightly colored alternative to formal news reporting, providing light relief from the ever-increasingly gloomy political discourse. So, instead of writing directly, so journalists use political cartoons to express their opinions regarding the current issues, especially in the political aspect of our society. So with the ability to distill news and opinion into a caricature, cartoons present accessible and instant commentary and analysis of the current affairs. So the next one, here it is, the cartoons. So cartoons are unique forms of journalism that contrast with conventional forms of communication. So the images can cast a powerful interpretation of the day's news. So they explain and explore stories in manner that articles cannot. So the images are powerful enough to make interpretation of the current events, of the relevant events in the society. So they explain and explore stories more effectively than the articles. So they are more effective than writing or video. So they capture the imitable human nature as their subjects in order to humanize the topic they depict. So the next one, caricatures. So caricatures are pictures, the descriptions, the imitations of a person in which a certain striking characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a comic or grotesque effect. So in order to create this somewhat like in the comic or the grotesque effect, so they express this characteristics of the certain subject they are imitating exaggeratedly. So yung sumusobra. So ito yung descriptions ng isang tao talagang sinusobra, yung malaki ang mata talagang nilalakihan talaga nila, or yung malaki ang ilong talagang nilalakihan talaga. So exaggerated, sumusobra. So in order to create katawa-tawa or yung entertaining effect. Okay, so let us go to the author's background. So who is Alfred McCoy, by the way? So let's see. Alfred McCoy was born in Massachusetts, USA. So he is a professor in the Southeast Asian history at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he also serves as the director of the Center for Asian Studies. So he has spent 30 years in writing about the Southeast Asian history and politics. So his publications include Philippine Cartoons, which was published in 1985, The Anarchy, 1994, Closer Than Brothers, Manhood at the Philippine Military Academy in 2000, and Lives at the Margin in 2001. So after earning his PhD in Southeast Asian history at Yale, the writings of McCoy in this region has focused on two topics. So his writings focuses mainly on two topics. These are the Philippine political history and the global opium trafficking. His interest is quite unique. So his teaching interests are modern Philippine social and political history, U.S. foreign policy, colonial empires in the Southeast Asian, global illicit drug trafficking, and CIA covert operations. Now let us go to the background of the book, The Philippine Cartoons. So the Philippine Cartoons has 377 cartoons compiled in a book. So it tells us the truth of the American era, as we all know that the Americans introduced a form of governance that is far more different than from the Spaniards. So Spaniards shows this, there's still the violence here in the American, but this, the American introduced democracy to us, right? Whereas the Spaniards, they are, I don't know, but they are monarchy in Spain, but they are very, there is this racial discrimination, there is this social division, or if you are a Pinoy, you are a Filipino, then you are far more below than them. Whereas this American introduced the governance of democracy, wherein the people are the voice in the government. So it shows us, the book shows us the conditions of the society and the government, as well as the changes in the culture and the way of living of the Filipinos during the American colonization. So the Philippine cartoons, which contains the 377 cartoons compiled in one book, tells us the conditions of our society and the government, as well as the changes in the culture and the way of living in the Filipinos during the American colonization. So, how do the Philippine press started? So, the history of the Philippine press. So, like the nationalist movement, which was a part, so the Philippine press established itself during a decade following the American invasion of 1898. So it was a remarkable ferment in the cultural creativity. So the brutal American conquest of these republics stoked to outrage in the Filipino nationalists, but the relatively liberal U.S. censorship laws after the end of the military law in 1901 provided an outlet for their protest. So there is still the violence during the American conquest. That is why Filipino nationalists were quite angry about this. So unlike the Spanish Commission Permanente de Censura, which simply banned all Filipino creativity, so American press controls were much more flexible. So it's very different from how the Spanish managed the Philippine creativity. So during the Spaniards' time, so are you familiar with this novel of Jose Rizal? So there is this pinagbabawal talaga yung pagbasa ng libro kapag nakita ka ay ewan ko, hinuhuli ba nila? Ganon. Well, in American press control, so they are more flexible. So alamin natin bakit. So, after the U.S. military rule ended with the establishment of the Philippine Commission in 1901, there was, in fact, no prior constraint upon publication. So, hindi pa binabawal. So, when Americans found a Filipino publication offensive, so they could use a strong libel or sedition laws to imprison editors, actors, and authors. So, unlike the Spanish colonization ng Espanyol na talagang hinuhuli nila, binaban talaga, the Americans, whenever they found out the Philippine publication somewhat not on their side or offensive, so they used laws to imprison the editors, the actors, and the authors of the publication. So, although the court sentences of the early American period seems harsh, so the general climate was sufficiently liberal to allow a flowering of the Philippine press. So, here we go again. So, the Filipino gained their earliest editorial experience as propagandists in Madrid as newspaper publisher in the Revolution in 1898 to 1899. So, on September 3, 1898, only weeks after the American occupation in Manila, the first Filipino newspaper, La Independencia, appeared. So, in September 3, 1898, La Independencia appeared. So the paper was directed by Antonio Luna and edited by men who later became leading journalists. So these are Fernando Maria Guerrero and Rafael Palma. So as the Philippine Republic collapsed in the guerrilla warfare in the face of the U.S. Army's advance across the central Luzon plain in 1890, La Independencia was reduced to 4 pages to 2 and finally closed altogether. So it's after the guerrilla warfare, so La Independencia eventually closed. So, the Republic's journalists returned to the cities before the revolution's final defeat to continue the nationalist struggle under the American rule. So, to combat the influence of La Democracia, so this is the newspaper published by pro-American Partido Federal, published by the pro-American Partido Federal. So if there is this nationalist newspaper, so there is also the pro-American La Democracia. So nationalist Pablo Ocampo brought out La Patria, which was closed in 1899. So nationalists started El Liberal, so which was soon banned, and Ocampo was exiled in Guam for 2 years. So after to combat the influence of La Democracia, so Pablo Ocampo brought out La Patria. So in order to combat its influence, which employed Rafael Palma and Aurelio Tolentino as journalists. So La Patria hired Rafael Palma and Aurelio Tolentino, but it was eventually closed in 1899. And after it's being closed, so nationalists started El Liberal, which was soon banned, and Ocampo was exiled in Guam for 2 years. So in early 1900s, so Palma moved to Cebu City, where he founded the city's first Filipino daily newspaper, the El Nuevo Dia, with Jaime de Vera and Sergio Osmeña. So the paper earned a formidable reputation as the opponent of the U.S. So after several attempts from La Patria to El Liberal, so they have this El Nuevo Dia, which became a formidable opponent of the U.S. So next, so 2 months after the American censorship ended with the establishment of civil government, Jose Palma launched El Renacimiento, which means rebirth. So the most influential early nationalist newspapers. So angered by the brutality of the U.S. Army conquest, so the Ilustrados used their literary and legal skills to carry on the nationalist campaign under comparatively liberal American colonialism. So the campaign continued for almost a decade and produced some major victories for the early nationalist movements. So here we go again. So when the Americans whenever felt offended by the publication, so they used libel and sedition laws. So the colony's first civil governor, so William Taft, used libel and sedition laws to mute hostility between the Manila Americans and the Filipino nationalists. So the U.S. colonial courts applied the same sedition laws far more strictly when Filipino writers were charged. So when Juan Cruz staged Hindi Ako Patay at Malabon in May 1903. So drunken, so yung mga lasing na US soldiers wrecked the scenery when the Katipunan flag was raised. So during this play of Juan Cruz na Hindi Ako Patay at Malabon in 1903, so these drunk US soldiers wrecked, sinira nila yung scene when the Katipunan flag was raised. But it was Cruz who was imprisoned for 2 years. So imagine the unfair unfair kay siya. So, the same goes for Aurelio Tolentino, who in the same month as Cruz staged kahapon, ngayon at bukas at the Manila Teatro Libertad. So, when the character played by Tolentino himself trampled on the US flag, Americans in the audience rioted and police charged Tolentino with subversion, and he was imprisoned for 2 years, the same as Cruz. So, at the same time, simultaneously, Dr. Dominador Gomez was charged with being the head of secret society of all rebels and bandits on the islands. So, Americans tried to prove that he was the real author of subversive dramas, so he was soon charged with the contempt and sedition and served a long sentence of hard labor in the old Bilibid prison. So, it was Zentau's successor, Governor General Luke Wright, in the southern, he was a southern racist, so he came and he made El Renacimiento struggle for survival. So, kontra juga ini sila. So, he charged the publisher Martin Ocampo and editor Guerrero with criminal libel. So, in 7 months of hearing, so Palma and Juan sumulong helped, so they inducted a constabulary system of pacification and law enforcement, and in February 1906, Judge Manuel Araulio ruled that El Renacimiento was innocent. So, dinamay na talaga ni General Luke Wright, so, ang El Renacimiento, so he charged the authors. So, he charged he charged Martin Ocampo and Guerrero. So, he sued El Renacimiento. But then, Palma and Juan Sumulong came and they helped. So, and eventually, El Renacimiento was proven innocent. Okay, the next one. So, the second great libel suit of the decade happened when El Renacimiento ran an editorial Aves de Rapina, or the Birds of Prey, pertaining to the Secretary of Interior, Don C. Worcester. So, Worcester then filed a civil libel claiming 100,000 pesos damages. Wow! The colonial government indicted Martin Ocampo and Calao for criminal libel. So when El Renacimiento was ruled guilty, so the Manila press responded with outrage, and the Philippine Free Press called for Worcester's resignation. So pinag-retire nila. So in January 1910, the other American judge hearing the civil suit ruled in favor of Worcester and ordered the sale of El Renacimiento entire assets to pay the damages of 16,000 pesos. So, however, Guerrero and Ocampo established another Spanish daily, La Vanguardia, in the same offices and survived until World War II as one of Manila's leading newspapers.
Now, let's move to some examples of Philippine cartoons during the American era. First is the municipal hygiene. As we can see in this caricature or cartoons, it's a wagoner who has a passenger which represented slaves of the foreign colonizer, and a large group of people that are disgusted represents citizens in Manila that are disgusted to the objects carried by the wagoner, wherein they cover their nose by the piece of clothes. They are in a hurry just to stay away from the wagon. This caricature exemplifies that diverse citizens of Manila were horrified and disgusted to the influence of Americans. Next is the law and order, democracy's greatest bulwark. Everyone's having a massive fight in the implemented law and order. They were holding guns and trying to burn the unbreakable wall of law and order. It happened in the province of Pampanga. There is a Department of Justice sleeping and chilling, ignoring the mess outside his wall because he does not care about the people. Communism just advocates class war and leads to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Department of Justice also acts on complaints, requests for legal assistance, and queries. Law and order is a situation characterized by respect for and obedience to the rules of the society. Incendiarism, the act of practice of illegal burning or arson, and bulwark, a defensive wall. Filipinos were fighting for proper law and order because the law and order is the greatest bulwark of wall towards democracy, and the Department of Justice is sleeping, ignoring its responsibilities. Next is the convenient blindness. In this picture or cartoons, we can see a group of people who involve themselves in gambling. It is the provincial officials who do nothing but gamble. It simplifies how they enjoy themselves in such gambling without focusing on their work as a provincial official. They are being blinded by the gambling and didn't see that people needed their attentions because they do not care. Next is the American worker, Filipino worker. In this caricature, an American worker at the left with cigar in his mouth and carrying a load effortlessly using an equipment, and on the other side, a Filipino worker struggling to carry a load in his back in the middle of the heat of the sun. Price tags are attached in each of the workers. $5 daily rate for the American worker, while 1 peso for the Filipino worker respectively. The American worker represents how convenient their jobs are using tools and equipment that they even barely sweat at work, while the Filipino worker shows how Filipinos struggles while working without any equipment to use and the undeniable heat of the tropical country. The price tag symbolizes the daily salary rate and its huge difference between American and Filipino workers. The facial expression and bodily gestures presented in the caricature speaks volumes on how both countries hugely differ in terms of labor. Most American workers rely on the use of mechanical devices to support their tasks, while Filipino workers have to do things with their own hands and strength. The issue present in the caricature is the evident inequality in the Philippines in terms of handling employers and laborers, by which when compared to America, laborers are supported greatly and receives decent pay for their works. Next is why the tenant farmer rebels or why the apacero rebels. As we can see in the caricature, is a farmer who is carrying a loads of pack. The farmer symbolizes the Filipino who suffers injustice and unfair treatment in labor. The pack at the farmer's back symbolizes the suffering and the injustice that tenant farmers experienced. Farmers suffer too much slavery, unfair treatment, and injustice. This caricature portrays the type of landlord's kind of treatment or labor to deprive tenant farmer of their rightful share of the harvest. Next is a new wrinkle in the art of thieving. It is a Filipino who strive to death to work and to serve an usurper under the heat of the sun, and the usurper just chilling in the other side while watching them. The usurper is the person who takes the power of the country or city or established region from themselves without legal right to claim as their own, while the homesteader is someone who settles lawfully on the government land with the intent to acquire title to it. It happened to the province of Nueva Ecija. During the American era, Filipinos become a follower of Americans, wherein Americans can do everything they wanted to do with the Filipinos. In the in the cartoons, we can clearly see that the Filipino farmers are striving really hard for their work and to serve American and just chi- we're, we're just chilling around on the other side while watching them suffer. Wherein the Americans is just an usurper, which means they don't really own the land because they are just claiming it without legal right to claim. But in the case that they have the power and authority during the American era, they can do whatever they wanted to do. Next is the ang dato-datoon ang kabus-kabuson. In these cartoons, we can see a man labeled as Industria Azucarera or known as sugar industry with a lot of influential people behind him. And on the other side is a poor farmer with a leveled production arrocera or rice production. The sugar industry portrays the rich people in the society, those who are abundance of resources. The poor farmer on the right side of the picture depicts the poor people who remain poor despite of their hard works. The cartoon's viewpoint mainly focuses on the issue of poverty, where the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer. Basing it on the situation depicted in the caricature, this social issue is caused by the unjust opportunities given to each sector in the economy. This includes poverty, trading environment, living wage, and starvation. And up to this day, it can still be observed that large number of Filipinos suffer because of poverty, just as how Filipino farmers in the present acquire less opportunity towards progress. And last is the great struggle has begun. Who would win? As we can see in the picture, Filipino are fighting back against Americans, but the Americans controlled Filipinos through seemingly harmless American objects by controlling their consciousness and mentally. Americans got to control and subjugate Filipinos. It is just that Filipino already gained their consciousness and started fighting back. With this, no one can tell whether Americans would win or Filipinos would win. It's the great struggle that already began, and no one knows who will win.
The next picture. So nothing between the two plates. So the cartoon discusses Secretary of War Taft visit in 1907. So considering the victory of the Nacionalista Party in the 1907 elections for the first Philippine Assembly, Taft was expected to make some statement of the independence in his inaugural address, but as the Filipinos saw it, Taft was pulling an old colonial trick used many times before the Americans. So among the Filipino meeting, Maestro Taft were D.H. Pardo de Tavera, so the second one from the left, Fernando Maria Guerrero, the sixth one from the left, Sergio Osmeña, the seventh one from the left, and Manuel Quezon, the extremely right. So it says here, so one of the groups says here, let us see what the great maestro has prepared. So the other one said, what is on the plate, maestro? So Taft replied, well, you see nothing between the two plates. So a member of Federalista Party said, we see that we have been fooled for another time. So this means that they expected Taft to make a statement about the inaugural address, but the story goes something like before, so they used the same tactic that fooled the Filipinos. So they were fooling Filipinos. The next one, El Ultimo Adios. So Sergio Osmeña was elected as the Assembly Speaker. So Taft took pains to show his support to Osmeña. Well, support na siya. So Taft told all Manila's influentials that Osmeña stood second only to Governor General. So that's what is being portrayed here in the comic, in the cartoon El Ultimo Adios. So the next, Heavy Load. So this cartoon shows Governor General Smith carrying the main burden of his administration while complaining and threatening to turn one portmanteau over the Filipino Commissioner T.H. Pardo de Tavera. So as you can see here, meron siyang maraming kargang-karga. So these were the burdens that he has to carry during his administration. So the last one. So the greeting. So the cartoon expresses a nationalist critique of the new assembly's disappointing first year. So the old lady, representing an aged version of the usually robust maidenly symbol of Filipinas, leads to a sick dog who represents a new assembly. Wow. So note that the date of the cartoon is the 4th of July in 1908. So elected on a platform of immediate independence, the assemblyman had been in the office nearly a year without making an effort to put forward of any sort of independence motion. So the assemblymen were quite lazy, I think. So they have not made any move to have this independence. So they are nakaupo lang pero walang ginagawa. So that's the end of our report. So don't forget, here's a quote from George Osborne. So the great thing about a political cartoon is that it sums up the state of play at any moment in politics. It is clever, it is funny, it is amusing. It informs and entertains us. It does all things in one drawing that the newspaper does all throughout its pages. So we get this contents of our report from the reference of the selected sections, Cartoons of the Philippine Political Caricature in American Era, 1940-1941, in www.academia.edu.ph. That's all for our report, and thank you for listening.